Protected areas like national parks and national reserves do a lot to protect the rights of endangered species. However, at the same time, they actually do very little to protect the rights of the humans who've been living in these areas for centuries. Thousands of families across the country have been evicted from their traditional homes, which happen to fall inside these protected areas. All of this is done in order to create a pristine habitat for these endangered species. Democratic governance laws, like the Forest Rights Act, didn't help them. And once they were evicted, development projects actually sprung up very close to their old homes. So why evict them at all? These are the questions that are answered in part by Losing Ground. Losing Ground is a new interactive map designed by the Environmental Justice Atlas and Kalpavriksha, which is an NGO based out of India. The product of 3 years of intensive fieldwork with on-ground communities, activists, and NGOs. This map shows us the state of evictions and displacements across 29 protected areas in India. In the process, it shows us how these national parks and reserves, the cornerstones of our conservation models, are actually disenfranchising Indigenous people. We spoke to the team to find out more about what they did and why they did it.
Very first and very strong impediment against a very democratic and rights-based policy like Forest Rights Act is the mindset, which we've had since colonial times of retaining the control, not trusting the local people, not trusting the local systems. And that is what the Forest Rights Act has faced right from the beginning. And even while it was being debated, there were huge debates. It's very interesting that there is actually a large number of conservation organizations and researchers who truly believe that if this act is implemented in true honesty and with the spirit of the act, it could actually lead to democratizing conservation, wildlife conservation in India. But then there is a handful of conservation organizations, very strong, very vocal, well-funded, and who have also been engaged with many of the displacement programs, who've been strongly against the act right from the beginning. And this in addition to the Forest Department, who's been the agency managing these protected areas and has had control over these protected areas. So this resulted into a large number of people associated with the Forest Department and conservation organizations taking the law to the court right in the beginning as soon as it was implemented. And it eventually reached the Supreme Court, where it continues to be argued, and one of the interim orders almost led to eviction of about 1 million people in India till it was stopped because of a huge hue and cry that was created around it. So this is the same attitude that plays out on the ground. In general, the implementation of the act in the country is really low, but in protected areas is even less. Not only is the implementation very less, it's also getting information about implementation is near impossible. It's almost like mentioning the word Forest Rights Act in protected areas is a crime, and you immediately face a negative reaction.
The international pressure as well that there are on climate change and greening policy, and also like the expansion of protected areas at the international level, somehow as creating also a narrative that we need to secure these protected areas. This narrative has somehow also strengthened the power of the Forest Department and the monopoly of the Forest Department over these territories. So this might also have affected the same implementation of the Forest Rights Act in India. So we can say that maybe this availability of funding not used properly, they have somehow helped also in fortify the so-called forest conservation model in India.
These impacts have generally been negative if you look at it from terms of local perspectives or local communities. There are displacement is one of the impacts, but there's restrictions on access to forests and forest produce. There's restriction on use. People are not allowed to enter. These wildlife policies, they've taken a generalized restrictive policy on use of forests without taking into consideration that there is a symbiosis between local communities and wildlife. there's a relationship, cultural and environmental relationship between these local communities. So if I had to give one example, if we can look at the Van Gujar community. So these are traditional pastoralist communities living in the western Himalayan regions. They practice transhumance. They during the summer months they live in the higher Himalayas, and during the winters they come to the lower Shivaliks. Now, see what has been the impact of restricting people from entering these forest areas. Van Gujars, this practice of transhumance has stopped. Like the Van Gujars have had to settle down in forest areas, and even then, they're continuously harassed by forest officials, terming them encroachers, sexual harassments against women. People are not allowed to, they're not allowed to sell them. Selling the milk was one of the. Now they have small amount of land which they use for agriculture. Even that is, forest officials come with bulldozers, tractors. They destroy the whole thing. So, and now again, that has been one of the impacts of just the wildlife policy. If you look at how the displacement has been of Van Gujars, not to talk about how they have been brutally evicted, but even the relocation where the forest department, where the state has claimed that they've been given a proper compensation. The land has been infertile. They've been given land which they cannot use. No proper compensation to give. Not proper compensation given to them. Houses not given to them. They've been shifted to lands which are still forest lands, and there's still elephants passing through that area, tigers passing through that area, and that the conflict still increase. So I think, to talk about it, the general impact of this one type of policy without recognizing local communities' rights and use of these forests, and the relationship has been negative. The forest lands which have been vacated, even these land, there is the development activities and all going on. So where is the conserving habitat as the forest, as it is always claimed, as it is claimed here?
While traveling in India and visiting these relocated communities, they were all of them. They were all in a very high state of poverty. And when we are speaking in in the media, we hear about how this relocation project has been like voluntary, and there has been the consent of the communities for the relocation. Most of the time, we have the proof that this has not happened, or if consent has been given, it was really under coercion. So many communities told us that they really didn't have any choice. Then the pressure inside the forest was so high that they just had to leave. Or somehow we also found in certain communities that white sheet of papers were given to them to sign their consent on relocation. So here we see a lot of illegality that have been really followed this relocation in India. But for me, what is also important to highlight is that these relocation are not only impacting their socioeconomic status of this community, but also their psychologies. As in many cases, these local community, they live in these forest areas, they inhabited these forest areas that are so much connected with their culture and their identity. So there is a very violent process of uprooting this community from their house that in many cases represent also their sacred spaces. So there are like deity in this forest. So it means obviously cut off this community from their entire culture and the entire way of living. And to speak about the positive relocation that the government is showcasing, for example, like the Similipal, the local community from Similipal Tiger Reserve in Odisha, they claim that have been a successful relocation. But when I went to visit the local community, they were really disappointed because what the government promised to them was agricultural land, but actually they only received homestead land. So they became just wage labor. And they were also living, one village was 100 kilometers far away from the forest, so also cut off from their relatives, because there are still villages inside Similipal Tiger Reserve. The community forest resource rights have been recognized in many of the villages, but beside that, this relocation is still going on.
There is plenty evidence that displacement and relocation has not worked. But how do we look at it ecologically speaking? Has it worked for ecological security of the country? So first of all, there is very little study of that, very little assessment. There are a few studies carried out in Corbett, maybe in some assessments in Mailghat and others. But I think we need to look at in three ways. First, these studies themselves, which say that over a period of time there have been ecological regeneration, are increasingly being countered by some ecological scientists themselves, saying that the positive result may not be as much as they are being highlighted. That's one aspect of it. Second aspect of it is that we are talking about 5% of the area, and within which really minuscule area that a village occupied, where we are trying to show that ecological regeneration has happened. But what does it mean in terms of larger ecological society, security of the country, or for wildlife as a whole? If we look at the UN summit on biodiversity that happened early October 2020, it clearly said that if we really want to deal with the ecological crisis, we need to have 30% of area under conservation. So if we want 30% of area conservation, this 5% after so much relocation, is it really safe even from the development projects which are coming up because of our consumptive needs? And are we going to be able to prove this ecological benefit in this 30% of landscape with the kind of population that we have and consumptive needs that we have? That's an important consideration to keep in mind.